This is Crimson Confessions. What you're about to hear are real relationship, marriage, and family confessions weekly compilation. Names and identifying details have been changed for privacy. Each story is different, but they all come from people trying to understand what they're living through. Listen carefully. You might recognize something. This channel is for discussion and shared experiences only. Advice given in comments reflects personal opinions, not professional guidance. I didn't marry just him. I married everyone's expectations, and I didn't fully realize that until I started feeling like I needed permission to breathe. Lately, it feels like I'm always standing just outside myself, watching the version of me that everyone else seems more comfortable with. I keep wondering when that happened. When I became someone who measures her words before speaking, even in her own home. When calm started to feel like silence instead of peace. I'm not angry all the time. That's what makes it confusing. I'm just unsure. Of myself. Of what I'm allowed to want. I didn't go into this doubting anything. I wasn't trying to rebel or prove a point. I genuinely believed I was doing the right thing. I told myself that compromise was maturity, that patience was strength, that discomfort was temporary. And maybe that's true. Or maybe that's just what you say when you don't trust your own instincts enough to listen to them. We met in the most ordinary way. Through people who knew people. A conversation that started politely, carefully. Messages that didn't rush anywhere. Felt safe because it was slow. There was no dramatic spark, just a steady warmth. I remember one afternoon where we talked longer than planned, nothing important, just daily things. What we ate. How work felt. The kind of small talk that quietly turns into familiarity. I remember thinking, this feels easy. That mattered to me. He felt kind, reassuring, especially when I was overwhelmed. When I doubted myself, he had a way of grounding me, of making things feel manageable. We talked about values, about family, about the future in broad, comfortable terms. We seemed aligned, or at least I thought we were. It wasn't passionate or intense, but it felt stable. And at that point in my life, stability felt like love. Early on, I trusted him because he listened. When I spoke, he didn't interrupt. When I worried, he didn't dismiss it. There was a sense that we were on the same side, facing the world together. I didn't need to be impressive around him. I could just be tired or uncertain, and it was okay. That kind of emotional comfort builds quietly. You don't notice it forming until you're already leaning on it. The first crack didn't look like a crack. It looked like respect. His parents had opinions, but I told myself that was normal. Families care. Families get involved. When they suggested things, he didn't argue, but he didn't seem bothered either. I told myself he was being considerate. That harmony mattered to him. And honestly, it mattered to me too. So I didn't question it. I adjusted. First, it was small decisions. What we should do. How we should do it. Things that seemed too minor to push back on. I remember thinking, this isn't worth tension. I can be flexible. Flexibility felt like love back then. Traditions were explained to me like facts, not choices. This is how it's done. This is what's expected. And every time I hesitated, I was reminded that feelings pass but family lasts. Disagreements slowly stopped being between us. They became family matters. Conversations shifted rooms. What we discussed privately never made it into public spaces. I noticed that my concerns were valid when we were alone, but inconvenient when others were present. So I learned to soften them, to postpone conversations, to tell myself later. After things settle, after this phase passes, there were moments that should have brought us closer. Shared meals, gatherings, celebrations, times when couples usually lean into each other. Instead, I felt myself shrinking, smiling at the right moments, staying quiet when something felt off. I told myself patience was temporary. I told myself this was the cost of being understanding. Whenever I tried to speak up, I was told to be patient. Repeatedly. As if patience were a virtue that could erase discomfort. As if waiting longer would somehow change what wasn't being acknowledged. Over time, my needs stopped sounding like needs. They were reframed as attitudes, as disrespect. That word stayed with me. It made me question my intentions. Am I asking too much? Am I being unfair? The turning point wasn't loud. There was no explosion. Just a quiet realization that settled in my chest and refused to leave. I noticed that my voice only mattered in private, never publicly. That support existed behind closed doors, but disappeared the moment others were involved. It wasn't that I wasn't heard. It was that I wasn't defended. I stayed longer than I probably should have. Not because I didn't feel the weight, but because I was afraid of what leaving would say about me. Afraid of shame. Afraid of being labeled difficult. I wanted to be the understanding spouse, the one who kept things together. Somewhere along the way, I started defending a situation that was slowly erasing me. There was a moment I still think about. Conflict that wasn't even mine. Tension that had nothing to do with my actions. And yet I apologized. Not because I believed I was wrong, but because I wanted it to end. Because I wanted peace more than truth in that moment. Sorry became my default. And when I said it, everything went quiet. That's when it scared me. I tell myself I wasn't weak. I was tired. I was trying to survive without disrupting everything around me. I tell myself that love sometimes asks for sacrifice. But then I wonder why the sacrificing always seemed to come from one direction. I wonder if I noticed too late. Or if I named the problem only after it had already shaped me. Now I'm sitting with questions that don't have easy answers. Staying feels like disappearing slowly. Leaving feels like destroying something that everyone else seems invested in. I don't know where self-respect ends and selfishness begins. I don't know how much family should influence a marriage, or when influence becomes control. I'm still deciding who I'm allowed to be. Not just as a wife, but as a person. Understanding didn't arrive all at once. Came in pieces. In quiet moments. In the way my body tenses before speaking. In how relief feels unfamiliar now. If you've lived through something like this, you might see it differently. Some people believe family unity matters more than individual boundaries. Others believe love should protect, not silence. I don't know where I land yet. What would you do if this were you? That's the end of this confession. Thanks for listening. The comments are open for reflection and shared experience. The next confession is different. It comes from someone facing a different situation but the same uncertainty. It didn't start with anger or shouting. It started with how quiet everything felt. Not peaceful quiet. Just empty. The kind where you're waiting for something to land and it never does. I remember sitting next to him and thinking, I should feel calmer than this. Instead, my chest felt tight, like I was holding my breath for no reason. I keep wondering if I imagined the problem. If I made something small into something heavy. Because on the surface, nothing was wrong. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't careless. He showed up. He stayed. And yet I was always second-guessing myself, asking whether it was fair to feel lonely when I wasn't being mistreated. I didn't know how to name what I was missing. I just knew I was tired. Tired of guessing what he felt. Tired of explaining myself into silence. Tired of feeling like asking for more made me needy or dramatic. I kept thinking maybe this is just what long relationships settle into. Maybe the discomfort was mine to manage. We met through mutual friends at a birthday dinner that wasn't supposed to matter. A loud table, mismatched chairs, too many conversations happening at once. He sat across from me and barely spoke. I remember noticing that he listened. Not the kind of listening that waits for its turn, but the quiet kind. When we left, he walked with me to my car and asked one thoughtful question. Nothing impressive. Felt easy. Familiar even though it wasn't. After that, we kept running into each other. Coffee shops, group hangouts, grocery aisles. It started to feel natural to look for him without admitting that I was. He didn't rush anything. He didn't push. And somehow that made me trust him faster than anyone else I'd known. What bonded us wasn't excitement. It was calm. He made space. When I talked, he didn't interrupt. When I rambled, he didn't correct me. I felt grounded around him, like I didn't have to perform to be chosen. We slipped into routines quickly. Morning coffee exactly the way we both liked it. Grocery trips that turned into inside jokes about which cereal was secretly elite. Little habits that felt like proof we were building something solid. I told myself this was what safety felt like. The first crack was so small I almost missed it. I would ask how he was really doing and he'd smile and say he was fine. Not defensively. Just flat. If I pushed gently, he'd shrug. Nothing worth talking about. I told myself he was private. that not everyone processed things out loud, that it was respectful even to not dump emotions everywhere. So I filled the silence for him. I'd offer explanations he could choose from. Maybe work was stressful. Maybe he was tired. Maybe I was overthinking. He'd nod sometimes like one of my guesses landed close enough, and that felt like connection even though it wasn't. Somewhere along the way, the conversations that mattered started getting postponed. Let's talk later. Not tonight. I'm too drained right now. I believed him every time. I told myself timing mattered, that good relationships waited for the right moment. The problem was the right moment never came. I started editing myself, trimming my thoughts before they left my mouth. If something bothered me, I'd weigh it first. Is this worth disrupting the calm? Most of the time the answer was no. I learned how to swallow feelings quickly. I learned how to smile through discomfort. I learned how to keep the peace by slowly disappearing from it. There were moments that should have brought us closer. Quiet evenings on the couch. Long drives with nothing but time. Even arguments that opened the door to honesty. But instead they ended with silence. He'd go still, not angry, not cold, just unreachable. And I'd feel the space between us widen, even though we were sitting inches apart. The loneliness surprised me. I'd felt alone before, actually alone, and it hadn't felt like this. This was sharper. Being next to someone who didn't meet you emotionally makes you question your own reality. I remember thinking I would feel less invisible if I were by myself. Once I cried. Not dramatically. Just quietly, the kind that slips out when you're exhausted. He looked at me, concerned but distant, and said everything was fine. Not dismissively. Comfortingly. Like he was trying to calm a child. And something in me sank. Because I realized he believed it. Or needed to. By the time it felt routine, I noticed I was rehearsing conversations in my head. Long, careful explanations of what I felt, how I'd say it without accusing him, how I'd make it easy to hear. And then I'd stop halfway through because I already knew how it would end. With him listening politely. With him saying he didn't realize I felt that way. With him saying things were okay. The turning point wasn't a fight. It was quieter than that. I realized he didn't really know me anymore. Not the current version of me. Not the one who had been bending and shrinking and waiting. And worse, he hadn't tried to know me. He assumed that because I was still there, because things weren't loud, nothing was wrong. That realization hurt more than any argument could have. It made everything before it reframe itself. The safety I thought I felt. The calm I trusted. The silence I defended. I started wondering if I'd mistaken emotional absence for loyalty. If quiet had just felt safer than the truth. I stayed longer than I should have. Part of me thought leaving would be unfair. How do you explain that someone didn't do anything wrong? They just didn't do anything at all. I was afraid of sounding ungrateful. Afraid of starting over. Afraid that maybe this was the best version of love I'd get, steady, present, but hollow. And here's the contradiction I can't escape. I defended the relationship because it was calm, while feeling erased by that same calm. I told myself I was lucky while grieving something I couldn't point to. I wondered if I was naming the problem too late, or if I'd known it all along and just didn't want to see it. I still don't know if silence can ever feel like love again. I don't know if emotional distance counts as betrayal when there's no affair, no secret life, no obvious wrongdoing. I only know how it felt to sit in a marriage that looked peaceful and feel unbearably alone inside it. If you've lived something like this, you might see it differently than someone who hasn't. Some people call this stability. Others call it neglect. I'm still somewhere in between, holding the question instead of the answer. What would you do if this were you? That's the end of this confession. Thanks for listening. The comments are open for reflection and shared experience. The next confession is different. It comes from someone facing a different situation but the same uncertainty. I didn't notice the fear right away. It came in quietly, disguised as relief. The kind that settles in your chest when you're tired of holding everything together and someone else says, "I've got it." I remember thinking that trust was supposed to feel like this. Light. Efficient. Adult. I trusted her with our finances, and somewhere along the way I stopped asking questions. I'm not sure when confusion became my default setting. I just know that I started feeling like I was always a step behind my own life. Not lost exactly. More like slightly delayed. I'd hear myself say things like, "I think we're fine," without really knowing what fine meant. I told myself it was normal to not know every detail, that couples divide responsibilities, that this was maturity, not avoidance. Still, there was a low hum of uncertainty I couldn't quite mute. We met through work events. Long hours, bad coffee, that shared look people give each other when they're both exhausted but still showing up. We'd end up talking longer than planned, decompressing about deadlines and pressure. Felt easy, familiar. One night stands out, sitting in a quiet corner after everyone else had left, comparing notes on stress like it was a language only we spoke. I remember thinking she seemed so composed about the future, like she had already mapped it out and was just inviting me along. Early on, that was part of the comfort. She was organized, confident, calm in a way I wasn't. When conversations turned to money, savings, plans, she didn't flinch. She spoke with certainty. I felt grounded listening to her. Relieved, honestly. I'd spent years worrying about getting it wrong, about not doing enough. Letting her lead felt like stepping off a ledge and realizing there was solid ground underneath. The first small crack didn't feel like a warning. It felt like a misunderstanding. I realized one day that I didn't fully understand our accounts anymore. Not in a dramatic way. Just a moment where I was trying to picture where everything was, and the image wouldn't come together. I told myself it was because things had gotten more complex, that this was what shared lives looked like. I rationalized it easily. Too easily. She offered to handle all the bills, to simplify things. It sounded practical, efficient. I agreed without hesitation. Then I stopped checking statements. First because I didn't need to, then because it felt awkward to ask. Like I'd be questioning her competence. Or worse, her integrity. I didn't want to be that person. The suspicious one. The one who turns teamwork into surveillance. Big decisions started happening without much discussion. A new commitment here. An adjustment there. She'd mention them casually, like they were already settled. I'd nod along, assuming it had all been thought through. When I did ask questions, they landed heavy. Like accusations I hadn't meant to make. I learned to soften my tone, then to shorten my questions. Eventually, to keep them to myself. There was an everyday moment that should have brought us closer. We were supposed to sit down together one evening just to look things over. No pressure. That was the plan. But the night turned into dinner, then into scrolling on our phones, then into sleep. Kept getting postponed. Tomorrow became next week. Next week became after things settle. I told myself it wasn't urgent. I told myself trust meant patience. Somewhere along the way, I realized I didn't know our financial reality. Not in a vague sense, in a concrete, unsettling way. I couldn't answer basic questions about our future without guessing. I felt embarrassed by that. Embarrassed enough to stay quiet. Embarrassed enough to believe that ignorance was better than conflict. I kept thinking that if I just held on a little longer, things would stabilize. That this was a temporary imbalance, not a permanent one. The turning point wasn't loud. It didn't come with an argument or a confrontation. It was quiet. A discovery I hadn't been looking for. Commitments I didn't remember agreeing to. Numbers that didn't align with the story I'd been telling myself. It wasn't the details that hurt the most. It was the realization that I'd been absent from decisions that shaped my own security. I sat with that for a long time before saying anything. Long enough for the weight to settle. I felt betrayed but also complicit. Afraid but unsure of who I was afraid of. I kept defending the situation in my head. Telling myself she was just being practical. That someone had to take control. Even as I felt erased by it. Even as trust started to feel expensive. The inner conflict surprised me with its persistence. Part of me wanted to stay, to fix it, to believe that imbalance didn't have to mean harm. Another part was quietly calculating how I'd start over financially at my age. That thought scared me more than I expected. The idea of rebuilding from a place I hadn't even realized I'd fallen into. I wondered if I'd waited too long to name the problem, or if I'd known all along and just chosen not to see it. I'm still not sure where that leaves us. I know that understanding didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces, each one heavier than the last. I don't know if trust can survive imbalance, or if ignorance is something we choose, or something we slip into when the cost of knowing feels too high. If you've lived something like this, I'm curious, what would you do if this were you? That's the end of this confession. Thanks for listening. The comments are open for reflection and shared experience. The next confession is different. It comes from someone facing a different situation but the same uncertainty. I wasn't unhappy enough to go. Just unhappy enough to disappear. It wasn't loud. It didn't crash. It was quiet, like something slowly dimming while everything else stayed the same. Most days I couldn't even explain what felt wrong. I just knew I felt smaller than I used to. Not sad exactly. Not angry. Just less present. Like I was watching my life from a step behind myself, trying to remember when I stopped feeling fully inside it. I kept telling myself this was normal, that this was what stability felt like. That comfort didn't need to feel exciting or sharp or defined. But there was this low hum of confusion I couldn't turn off. A sense that I was losing something important without being able to name it. I doubted myself constantly. I wondered if I was being ungrateful, dramatic, impatient. I asked myself if everyone felt this way eventually and just learned not to talk about it. I didn't want to be someone who couldn't appreciate what they had. We met during a time when neither of us was fully settled. Everything around us felt in motion. Careers shifting. Routines forming for the first time. We were figuring things out side by side, and that made it feel meaningful. Like we were choosing each other while becoming ourselves. I remember one ordinary moment clearly. Sitting somewhere plain. No big conversation. Just the quiet comfort of sharing space and planning the next few weeks. It felt steady. Safe. Like we were building something that could hold weight. Early on, that steadiness was what pulled me in. We showed up for each other. Supported each other's goals. Celebrated progress in small ways. There was a rhythm to our days that felt grounding. I trusted that rhythm. It gave me structure when everything else felt uncertain. It didn't feel like losing myself then. It felt like growing alongside someone. Like our lives were aligning, not merging. The first crack was subtle. Easy to dismiss. I started noticing that it was hard to tell where I ended and the relationship began. My preferences softened. My opinions adjusted. Not because anyone asked me to change, but because it felt easier. I told myself that compromise was healthy. That closeness meant overlap. That this was what partnership looked like when it worked. So I didn't question it. I leaned into it. Somewhere along the way, my interests began to fade. Not dramatically. I didn't wake up one day and abandon them. I just stopped reaching for them. Hobbies became memories. Passions turned into things I used to talk about. I noticed it, but I didn't stop it. Decisions started being made as us. It sounded mature, responsible, forward-thinking. But quietly, my own voice started arriving later in the conversation. If it arrived at all. I adjusted without thinking. I agreed without checking in with myself. I avoided being alone. That part scares me when I think about it now. Being alone felt unsettling, like silence I couldn't fill. I preferred togetherness even when it felt thin. Even when it didn't really bring closeness. There were moments that should have brought us closer. Evenings meant to feel intimate. Milestones that should have felt shared. Instead, they felt routine. Like we were performing familiarity rather than experiencing it. I noticed the distance, then immediately told myself not to overthink it. I felt guilty for wanting more. More space. More definition. More sense of self. I framed those desires as selfish. I reminded myself of the history we shared. Of the time invested. Of how much we had built. By the time it felt routine, I barely recognized myself. Not in a dramatic way. Just in small moments. Catching my reflection and feeling disconnected. Being asked simple questions and hesitating longer than I should have. The turning point didn't arrive as an argument or an ultimatum. It came quietly. I was asked who I was, not in a philosophical way, just casually, and I couldn't answer without referencing them. My plans. My preferences. My future. Everything was framed around we. That realization stayed with me longer than I expected. It wasn't shocking. It was heavy. Like noticing a slow leak after the room has already filled with water. I started feeling invisible. Not to them exactly, but to myself. Like I had become a supporting character in my own life. I defended the relationship while feeling erased by it. I told myself it was good while quietly grieving who I used to be. I wrestled with the idea of staying versus leaving. Leaving felt like admitting failure. Like saying all that time, all that effort, all that shared history didn't lead where it was supposed to. I was afraid of starting over. Afraid of being alone with myself again. Unsure who that even was. At the same time, staying felt like a slow surrender. Like choosing safety over truth. I worried that leaving would be unfair. That wanting something different meant I hadn't tried hard enough. That maybe I was just restless. There were moments when I wondered if I had waited too long to name the problem. If I had noticed earlier, would things feel different now? Or was I always going to arrive here eventually? I still don't know the answer. Understanding didn't arrive all at once. Came in pieces. In quiet realizations. In moments where I felt both grateful and hollow at the same time. I'm still wondering what it means to walk away from something stable. Whether leaving means losing everything, or finally finding what I misplaced along the way. I don't have clarity. Just questions that won't stay quiet anymore. If you've ever been in something that felt safe but slowly erased you, how do you know when loyalty turns into self-abandonment? That's the end of this confession. Thanks for listening. The comments are open for reflection and shared experience. The next confession is different. It comes from someone facing a different situation but the same uncertainty. Nothing physical happened, but something crossed a line. That's the sentence I keep repeating to myself when the room goes quiet and my phone lights up. When I feel that small tightening in my chest that I pretend is nothing. It doesn't feel like a crisis. It feels like standing in a doorway too long, knowing you're blocking something but not moving. Lately, I don't feel like a bad person. I feel confused. I feel like I'm constantly adjusting my own story, just enough to stay comfortable inside it. I wake up and go through the motions, and somewhere in the middle of that, there's this awareness that I'm carrying something unfinished. I don't know if it's guilt or caution or just fear of naming things too clearly. I tell myself I'm being careful. I tell myself I'm protecting what matters. But I also know I'm tired of having to tell myself anything at all. I met my partner through friends. There was nothing dramatic about it. We kept ending up at the same gatherings, sitting on the same couches, laughing at the same small things. At some point, it just became normal that we'd leave together. There's one memory that always comes back to me. Standing in a kitchen late at night, dishes half done, the house quiet except for us talking about nothing important. It felt easy. It felt like something I didn't have to think my way through. That ease turned into routine. And the routine turned into trust without effort. We rarely argued. We knew each other's schedules, each other's moods. We didn't need constant reassurance because it was already built into how we lived. There was comfort in that. Not excitement exactly, but steadiness. I didn't feel like I was performing or proving anything. I felt known in a way that was calm, not intense. Safe maybe. Grounded. I can't point to a moment where that changed. That's part of what makes this so hard to explain, even to myself. There wasn't a fight or a distance that announced itself. It was quieter than that. Somewhere along the way, I noticed that someone else understood me faster. Not better, just faster. Conversations felt lighter. Less filtered. I didn't have to explain the context before saying the thing. At first it felt like relief, not danger. I told myself that was allowed. People talk. People connect. I told myself it didn't take anything away from my relationship because nothing was being added anywhere else. It was just conversation. Just words. And I didn't hide it, not at first. It didn't feel like something that needed hiding. Then I started noticing how often those conversations happened. How my mood lifted when I saw a message come in. How I'd hold my phone a little closer to my chest without realizing it. When my partner asked what I was smiling at, I answered, but vaguely. I didn't think of it as lying. I thought of it as simplifying. There were things I shared that I didn't bring home. Not because I couldn't, but because I didn't want to dull them by explaining. There's a difference between not wanting to repeat yourself and not wanting to be seen. I didn't know which one I was doing. I only knew that some parts of my day felt easier to give away somewhere else. Guilt didn't arrive all at once. It settled in like background noise. Something you notice only when everything else goes quiet. I'd feel it while doing ordinary things, grocery shopping, folding laundry, sitting next to my partner on the couch while we watched something we'd already seen before. These were moments that should have brought us closer. Instead, I felt slightly elsewhere, like my attention had a second address. There was a conversation I kept postponing. Not a big one. Just a check-in. Hey, I've been feeling off lately. I told myself I'd wait until I could explain it cleanly, until I understood it better. Each time I delayed, it felt responsible, like I was sparing us confusion. But I was also silencing myself, choosing quiet over honesty because honesty felt heavier than I expected. I justified everything as harmless. Nothing physical happened. I repeated that like a shield. I defended the situation even as it started to feel like it was defending itself against me. I didn't cross any obvious lines, but I stopped looking too closely at where the lines were. I told myself that intention mattered more than impact, and that my intention was never to hurt anyone. The turning point didn't come with confrontation or discovery. It came with a realization I didn't want. I noticed that when something meaningful happened, a good day, a hard thought, a moment I wanted to share, my first instinct wasn't home anymore. It was elsewhere. Quietly. Automatically. That's when the illusion broke. Not dramatically. Just enough to let the truth in. I started asking myself questions I didn't have answers for. Was I already betraying something just by being honest with someone else? Or was I betraying it by not being honest at home? I worried that admitting any of this would sound worse than it was. That naming it would give it weight it didn't deserve. Or maybe weight it already had and I'd just been ignoring. I'm torn between staying silent and speaking up. Silence feels like protection, like choosing stability over chaos. But it also feels like cowardice some days. Like I'm preserving the shape of something, while letting the substance quietly thin out. I'm afraid of being unfair. Afraid of hurting someone who hasn't done anything wrong. Afraid of starting over when nothing is technically broken. There's a contradiction I can't escape. I defend the situation by saying it means nothing, yet I feel erased by how much space it takes up in my head. I tell myself I'm loyal while questioning why loyalty suddenly feels like something I have to define. Sometimes I wonder if I waited too long to name the problem, or if naming it earlier would have made it real before it needed to be. By the time it felt routine, I didn't know where the line was anymore, or if it had moved because I let it. I don't know if honesty would destroy everything, or if silence already is. I only know that understanding didn't arrive all at once. It came slowly in moments I tried to ignore, in pauses I filled too quickly. I'm sharing this because I don't have a conclusion. I'm still standing in that doorway, unsure if not stepping forward is an act of care or fear. People disagree on what counts as betrayal. I get that now. I'm not asking to be told what to do. I'm just trying to understand what this was, and what it might already be. So I want to know, where do you think the line really is? That's the end of this confession. Thanks for listening. The comments are open for reflection and shared experience. The next confession is different. It comes from someone facing a different situation but the same uncertainty. First, it felt like care. Like someone finally noticed how tired I was, how much I was carrying. It felt steady, protective, almost like relief, until it started to feel like permission. I'm still trying to explain that part to myself. How something that once made me feel safer slowly made me feel smaller. I keep replaying moments, wondering when the line moved, or if it was always there and I just didn't see it. Some days I think I'm overthinking it. Other days I feel embarrassed that I didn't question it sooner. I don't fully trust my read on it anymore, and that might be the hardest part. We met during a time when everything in my life felt unstable. I don't mean dramatic chaos, just that quiet kind of stress that follows you everywhere. Deadlines, family stuff, that constant feeling of being behind no matter how hard you try. He showed up when I didn't have much energy to explain myself. I remember one night, sitting in my car after a long day, phone in my hand, and realizing he'd already noticed something was off. He asked how I was before I even found the words. That mattered to me. In the beginning, his attention felt grounding. He was always available, always checking in. If I didn't respond right away, he followed up. Not annoyed, just concerned. He remembered small details I forgot I'd shared. It felt like being held in someone's focus, like I didn't have to carry everything alone anymore. I trusted that. I leaned into it. It wasn't intense in a loud way. It was quiet, consistent, reassuring. The first crack didn't look like a warning. It sounded reasonable. He questioned a choice I made and framed it as concern, said he just wanted what was best for me. I remember thinking maybe he sees something I don't. I was tired after all. Stressed. So I let it pass. I told myself this was what support looked like. Someone paying attention. Someone invested. Over time, suggestions started to feel heavier. What he thought I should do came with an expectation I didn't know how to name yet. If I chose differently, there was a pause. A shift in tone. Not anger. Just disappointment, like I'd missed something obvious. I started explaining myself more, justifying decisions that never needed justification before. Independence began to feel selfish. Like choosing for myself meant choosing against us. Somewhere along the way, I noticed I was asking for approval. Not outright, not formally. Just small check-ins. Does this make sense? Ruining this by you first. It didn't feel dramatic, it felt practical. Like avoiding unnecessary tension. When I did push back, even gently, the air between us changed. Things got quiet. Tight. I hated that feeling, so I learned how to prevent it. There were moments that should have brought us closer. Simple things. Everyday things. Planning a weekend. Making small decisions together. Instead, they left me feeling oddly alone. Like I was present but not fully participating. I started silencing parts of myself without even noticing. Letting preferences go. Choosing the path of least resistance. Telling myself this was compromise. The turning point wasn't loud. There was no argument. No explosion. Just a moment where I hesitated before doing something simple, something that used to be automatic. And I caught myself thinking, what would he think about this? Not because I wanted his input, but because I didn't want the tension. That scared me more than anything else had. That's when the illusion cracked. Quietly, I realized I'd been shrinking, not because he asked me to directly, but because peace seemed to require it. I was adjusting myself to fit a version of love that felt safer when I took up less space. And that's where the conflict lives. Because part of me still wants to defend it. To say he was just trying to protect me. That his intentions were good. That love is supposed to involve care. And another part of me feels erased by how careful I've become. Like I traded autonomy for calm, and I'm not sure when I agreed to that exchange. I wonder sometimes if I waited too long to name what was happening, or if I named it too late because naming it meant I'd have to decide what to do next. Starting over feels heavy, being alone feels risky, and staying feels quiet in the wrong way. I'm still here, still deciding what freedom should feel like. Still sitting with the question instead of answering it. Understanding didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through hesitation, through silence, through the parts of myself I almost forgot were mine. If you've lived something like this, you might see care where I see control. Or control where I once saw care. I don't think there's a clean answer. Just different experiences pressing against each other. I'm sharing this because it's still unfolding, and maybe because someone else is standing at the same edge, trying to name what they're feeling. When does protection turn into control? That's the end of this confession. Thanks for listening. The comments are open for reflection and shared experience. The next confession is different. It comes from someone facing a different situation but the same uncertainty. Living together didn't bring us closer. Did the opposite. It stripped away the pauses and the distance that used to protect us, and suddenly there was nowhere for doubt to hide. I remember standing in the kitchen one night, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, feeling this quiet pressure in my chest, like I was holding my breath without realizing it. I don't know how to explain who I am in this story without sounding like I already know the ending. I didn't. I was confused more than hurt at first. I kept telling myself I was tired, overwhelmed, adjusting. I questioned my reactions constantly. Was I being paranoid? Was I projecting old fears onto a new situation? I felt unsure of my own judgment, like my emotions were slightly out of sync with reality, always a step behind. We met through work connections. Nothing dramatic. Just overlapping circles, familiar names, a few conversations that slowly turned into something more. We dated long distance for a while, which sounds harder than it felt. In some ways it made everything easier. We planned calls. We scheduled weekends. There was intention in every interaction. I remember one night in particular, sitting on my bed with the lights off, phone pressed to my ear, laughing quietly so I wouldn't wake anyone else. It felt deliberate, like we were choosing each other every time. That distance created trust, or at least something that felt like it. We talked for hours about the future, about what kind of lives we wanted, about moving in together one day like it was a shared goal we were slowly earning. It felt mature, serious, safe. There was comfort in knowing when the next call would come, in knowing we'd make time no matter how busy things got. I trusted the consistency. When we finally closed the gap, it felt like a natural next step. We found an apartment together, signed a lease, bought mismatched furniture we both pretended to like. The first few weeks felt like settling into a rhythm. Groceries, shared meals, quiet evenings on the couch. Ordinary things that were supposed to make us feel closer. The first crack was small enough to ignore. He became guarded about his phone. Not secretive in an obvious way, just careful. Turning it face down. Taking it with him when he left the room. I noticed it and then I immediately explained it away. Everyone deserves privacy, I told myself. We were adjusting. Living together meant new boundaries. But then I started noticing habits he'd never mentioned. Small routines. Certain times he always seemed distracted. Ways he'd phrase things that didn't quite line up with the stories I already knew. Nothing I could point to and say this is wrong. Just details that didn't fit cleanly. Our conversations began to feel rehearsed. Like he was choosing his words a little too carefully, even when we were talking about nothing important. I'd ask how his day was, and the answer would be smooth but shallow, familiar but incomplete. I caught myself filling in the gaps for him, nodding along, pretending I understood. There were small lies, not dramatic ones, the kind that only matter when you put them next to older versions of the same story. Dates that shifted, explanations that changed slightly. I'd remember something he'd told me months earlier and wonder if I'd misheard it then. I started doubting my memory instead of his honesty. Somewhere along the way, I stopped trusting my instincts. I told myself I was overanalyzing, that moving in together comes with stress, with friction, with learning curves. I postponed conversations I knew I should have. I'd rehearse what I wanted to say in my head, and then decide it wasn't the right moment. I didn't want to create problems where there might not be any. There were everyday moments that should have brought us closer, but didn't. Cooking dinner together in silence. Sitting next to each other on the couch, both scrolling, the space between us feeling wider than it ever had when we lived in different cities. Even shared routines started to feel tense. The apartment didn't feel like a place to rest. It felt like a place where I was constantly alert. I kept quiet more than I want to admit. I swallowed questions. I laughed things off. I told myself that love sometimes means patience, that not everything needs to be confronted immediately. I defended the situation even as it made me feel smaller. I wanted to believe we were just in a phase. The turning point wasn't explosive. There was no single discovery, no dramatic confrontation. It was quieter than that. I realized one morning watching him get ready that I knew his routine perfectly. What time he woke up, how he made his coffee, which days he left early. But I didn't feel like I knew him. Not in the way I thought I did. That realization sat with me longer than anything else. I wasn't uncovering secrets so much as noticing an absence. The illusion didn't shatter. It faded. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I started asking myself questions I'd been avoiding. Was I staying because I loved him, or because leaving felt too complicated? We had a shared lease, shared furniture, shared plans that were now woven into my sense of stability. The idea of starting over felt exhausting. I worried about being unfair, about accusing him of things I couldn't fully articulate. At the same time, I felt erased in small ways, like I was adjusting myself to fit around something that wouldn't name itself. I defended our relationship to friends while feeling increasingly alone inside it. That contradiction became harder to live with. By the time it felt routine, I wondered if I'd waited too long to name what was wrong, or if I was only noticing now because the distance was gone and there was nothing left to distract me. I even questioned whether moving in together had been the mistake, not the timing of it. Whether love can survive without full trust, or if trust is something you only realize you needed once it's missing. I don't have a resolution. I don't know if I fell in love with him, Or with the version of him I never questioned? Understanding came slowly in fragments, not all at once. And I'm still sitting with that uncertainty. If you've lived through something like this, or see it differently, how do you think about trust when two lives start sharing the same space? That's the end of this confession. Thanks for listening. The comments are open for reflection and shared experience. The next confession is different. It comes from someone facing a different situation but the same uncertainty.
Everyone praised my sacrifice, and I nodded along, even though I was already tired in a way I didn't know how to explain. It wasn't the kind of tired sleep fixes. It was heavier, like something inside me had been holding its breath for too long. I don't even know when that feeling started exactly. I just know that by the time I noticed it, it felt normal to carry it around. I told myself this was adulthood. This was responsibility. This was what it looked like when you did the right thing, even if it didn't feel good anymore. Emotionally, I live in a strange middle place. I'm not angry all the time. I'm not devastated either. I'm just muted. I second-guess myself constantly. I wonder if I'm being dramatic. I wonder if everyone else feels this way and just doesn't say it out loud. Some days I convince myself I'm fine. Other days, I feel like I've misplaced a version of myself and don't know when it happened. We met young. Young enough that the future felt like a shared project instead of a question. There wasn't anything dramatic about it. We were just two people who liked each other, talked easily, and imagined a life that made sense on paper. I remember sitting on the floor of a half-empty apartment, eating takeout straight from the containers, talking about where we'd be in 5 years. It felt grounded, responsible, like we were building something solid. Early on, what bonded us was teamwork. We were good at planning, good at agreeing on goals. We talked about careers, about kids, about doing things the right way. There was comfort in that. I trusted her because things felt aligned. I didn't feel swept away. I felt steady. And at the time, steady felt like love that would last. The first crack didn't look like a problem. We just stopped talking about anything that wasn't practical: schedules, bills, appointments. What needed to be done next? I noticed it, but I brushed it off. We were busy. We were building a family. Conversations change when life gets full. That's what I told myself. I didn't want to be the person who complained when everything was technically working. Parenting slowly replaced partnership. Not all at once. Just enough that it felt gradual and reasonable. Our roles became clearer than our connection. We coordinated instead of connected. We managed instead of shared. I told myself this was a phase. That once things settled, we'd find our way back. Conflicts didn't disappear, they just got postponed. Anytime something felt off, there was a reason not to address it. The kids were too young. Work was stressful. Now wasn't the right time. I learned how to swallow thoughts mid-sentence. I learned how to tell myself it wasn't urgent. Silence became easier than disruption. Somewhere along the way, my emotional needs started to feel selfish. Wanting to be seen felt indulgent. Wanting to be heard felt like asking for too much when everyone else depended on me. So I adjusted. I lowered the volume on myself. I showed up, provided, stayed calm. I became reliable. There were moments that should have brought us closer. Family dinners. Weekend outings. Sitting together after the kids went to sleep. But even then, it felt like we were in parallel lanes. Present, but not really with each other. I'd sit on the couch and feel oddly alone, even though nothing was technically wrong. Resentment didn't arrive loudly. It grew quietly, tucked behind routines. I didn't lash out. I didn't shut down completely. I just felt less visible over time. Like my value was tied to how smoothly things ran. Like as long as I kept everything moving, there was no need to ask how I was doing. The moment that shifted something wasn't a fight or a betrayal. It was small, almost unremarkable. I realized that when I was appreciated, it was always for what I did, what I handled, what I provided, not for who I was. And that realization sat with me in a way I couldn't shake. I started noticing how often my absence wouldn't really change much, as long as the structure remained intact. I was interchangeable with my function, and that scared me more than I wanted to admit. Staying felt like the obvious choice. The children, the stability, the way people spoke about commitment as if endurance itself was love. There was approval in staying. Quiet praise. I absorbed that. I told myself I was doing something noble. But then there was a moment, late, ordinary, forgettable by most standards, where I imagined a life alone. Not a dramatic escape, just quiet. And instead of panic, I felt relief. That relief scared me more than any argument ever had. I argued with myself constantly after that. How could I even think that way? Didn't good parents stay? Didn't responsible adults push through discomfort? I defended the situation even as I felt erased by it. I told myself I was lucky, while feeling increasingly absent from my own life. Sometimes I wonder if I waited too long to name what was wrong, or if I noticed it early and just didn't allow myself to say it out loud. It's hard to tell when endurance turns into self-betrayal. I'm still here, still showing up, still doing what's expected. But I don't know who I'm modeling adulthood for anymore. I don't know if staying is teaching strength or silence. And I don't know if leaving would be courage or damage. Understanding didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, between carpools and bedtime routines and quiet moments where I felt like a guest in my own life. If you've lived something like this, I'm curious how you see it now. Was staying the right choice, or just the easiest one?
That's the end of this confession. Thanks for listening. The comments are open for reflection and shared experience. The next confession is different. It comes from someone facing a different situation but the same uncertainty. Nothing went wrong. That's the part that keeps circling in my head. There wasn't a betrayal or a fight that blew everything open. There was just this quiet feeling like I was standing in a room that hadn't changed, while something in me had. I've been trying to name what I feel, and it keeps slipping away. It's not anger. It's not disappointment exactly. It's more like confusion layered with guilt. Like I'm holding something fragile and I don't know if putting it down will break it, or if holding it longer will. Some days I tell myself I'm overthinking. Other days I wonder how long I've been editing myself without noticing. I keep asking when this started, but every answer feels unfinished. We met during a time when my life felt settled. Not exciting, not dull, just steady. The kind of phase where routines feel comforting instead of suffocating. We built ours slowly. Weeknight dinners that always happened around the same time. Grocery lists we didn't need to discuss anymore. A shared understanding of what the weekends were for. One memory keeps coming back to me. Sitting across from him at a small table, the kind that wobbles if you lean too hard. He was talking about something ordinary, maybe work or a show we'd both already seen, and I remember thinking how easy it all felt. No nerves. No guessing. Just being there. That ease became the foundation. Trust wasn't something we declared. It was something that settled in quietly. He felt like a place I could rest. Someone who knew my habits, my moods, the way I liked things done without me having to explain them. We talked about plans in a calm, practical way. Nothing grand. Just a shared assumption that we were moving forward on the same track. Felt safe. Felt like something you protect. I think that's why the first crack was so easy to ignore. It wasn't a moment. It was more like a shift in direction. I started thinking about things I wanted, changes, challenges, ideas that didn't fit neatly into the life we'd outlined together. Meanwhile, his goals stayed exactly where they were. Solid. Familiar. Unmoved. First, I told myself that was normal. People don't grow at the same pace all the time. That didn't mean anything was wrong. I rationalized it easily. I didn't want to make something out of nothing. But somewhere along the way, I started feeling restless for no clear reason. Nothing in our daily life had changed. Yet I felt this low-level agitation, like I was waiting for something unnamed to happen. Our conversations began to loop. Not badly. Just predictably. The same topics, the same responses. I found myself finishing his sentences in my head, not because I knew him so well, but because nothing surprised me anymore. There were moments when I wanted to say more. When a thought about the future or a new ambition rose up, and I swallowed it. I told myself it wasn't the right time, or that it would only complicate things. So I stayed quiet. Again and again. Guilt started replacing excitement. When I imagined changes, I immediately thought of what it would cost him. I measured my own growth against his comfort and felt ashamed for even wanting more. There were everyday situations that should have brought us closer. Celebrations. Quiet evenings meant for connection. Instead, I felt oddly distant, like I was performing a role I'd agreed to but hadn't reread in a while. By the time it all felt routine, gratitude had become a trap. He was kind. Consistent. He showed up. And because of that, I felt indebted to stay the same version of myself I'd been when we started. The turning point didn't come with an argument. It came quietly. In a moment where I realized I was translating love into endurance. I still cared. I still wanted him to be okay. But I wasn't aligned with the life we were building anymore. That realization scared me more than anything dramatic could have. Because there was no villain. No clear reason I could point to without sounding ungrateful. Inside me, two fears kept colliding. The fear of leaving someone who did nothing wrong. And the fear of staying and slowly disappearing. I defended the relationship even as I felt erased by it. I told myself that stability was rare and precious, while privately resenting how small I'd begun to feel. I hated that contradiction in myself. Hated that I could hold both at once. Sometimes I wonder if I waited too long to name the problem, or if I noticed it early and chose comfort instead of honesty. I can't tell which version is worse. What I do know is that resentment crept in where silence lived. I started blaming him for choices I never voiced, for paths I didn't take. And that felt unfair even as it felt true. Now I'm stuck in this unresolved space. Unsure whether staying is an act of kindness or avoidance. Unsure whether leaving is honesty or betrayal. Understanding came slowly, not all at once, and it still feels incomplete. I'm sharing this not because I have an answer, but because I know others sit in this same quiet uncertainty. Some people will say growth is personal and necessary. Others will say loyalty means staying when nothing is broken. What would you do if this were you? You've reached the end of this week's Confessions. Thank you for listening. If any of these stories stayed with you, you're welcome to share your thoughts in the comments. New confessions are shared regularly. You're not alone in what you're trying to understand.